The senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm here today to talk about the President's budget, which he submitted today. In an era of trillion-dollar deficits and an historic debt and the greatest level of government spending since World War II, I believe the President's submission today was not. Instead of keeping his campaign promise to cut the deficit in half in his first term, this budget assumes continued deficits this year and next in the trillion-dollar range. Given the promises President Obama made when he came to the White House and how poorly the last budget was received by Republicans and Democrats alike in Congress, in fact, it was voted on here in the floor of the Senate, and it was defeated by a vote of 97-0. Given those things, I'd hoped that President Obama would step forward and turn the rhetoric into action and put forward a responsible budget to deal with the fiscal problems that our country faces. No more punting, no more gimmicks, a real budget that honestly confronts the fiscal crisis we've got and helps to get us back on track. Instead, we see a document today that's really more tailored toward campaign talking points than it is addressing the $15 trillion debt that we now have, and again, these trillion-dollar deficits. The President begins in this budget by proposing a new stimulus of $350 billion. And by the way, that's $350 billion with no offsets, in other words, no spending reductions to pay for it. The President's budget then claims $5.3 trillion in deficit reduction over the next decade. As I've looked at this budget today, it seems to me only a minuscule amount of this is from new spending cuts. In fact, as I read this budget, 19.9% of the claimed deficit reduction consists of the following. One, tax increases, about $1.9 trillion. Two, Iraq-Afghanistan war savings, which is viewed by most here in Congress on both sides of the aisle as a gimmick. In other words, spending money that was not going to be spent anyway. That's $848 billion. Third, already enacted discretionary caps and entitlement changes, primarily from the Budget Control Act. These were the so-called sequesters or across-the-board spending cuts that Congress has already enacted. That's $1.7 trillion. And finally, net interest savings from those policies, which the budget says is going to be $800 billion. So out of the claimed $5.3 trillion in deficit reduction, that leaves about 0.1%, $4 billion of the claimed savings over the decade. So 99.9% of the deficit reduction that he claims is either from tax increases or, again, changes in spending that either have already occurred or they're not going to occur. On top of that, the President hid in his baseline, so the baseline he assumes for his spending, he hides about $479 billion in new spending. Now, this is on Pell Grants and on a Medicare doc fix. So the claimed savings, even of $4 billion, vanished completely. Overall, when compared to the current policy baseline, the President would tax $4 trillion more, spend about $2 trillion more over the next 10 years of this budget. The yearly deficit would end the decade in the $600 billion range, even assuming peace, prosperity, and historically low interest rates. And the national debt over the next 10 years would rise by $11 trillion for a total debt of over $25 trillion 10 years from now. The main tax hike would end the 2001-2003 tax cuts for singles making over $200,000 and couples making over $250,000. There will be a lot of debate on the floor regarding this tax policy over the next year as we come toward the end of the year when all of $5 trillion of them are scheduled to end. But just with regard to this tax cut, this will result in lower economic growth and more job losses, according to the Congressional Budget Office. They've now testified before the Budget Committee as to the fact that this will result in a higher unemployment next year. This is in large part because, according to Internal Revenue Service data, 48% of small business income, 48% of small business income would be subject to higher taxes under this budget proposal. So I support tax reform. I think it's important. But simply taking the current code and adding higher tax rates is going to have an impact on small business and therefore on our economy and on jobs. And this is ultimately about jobs. And it's about everyday economic concerns that people in Ohio and around the country have. In this budget document, we do see some honesty, but it doesn't make me optimistic at all. Acknowledging the impact this budget will have on the economy, the President's budget actually concedes unemployment rates next year higher than this year, and the year after higher than this year. His prediction is that unemployment rates will be 8.9% in 2012 and 8.6% in 2013. Totally unacceptable. And a testament to the fact that Washington can't continue to rely on short-term sweeteners and budget spending gimmicks to grow our economy and get the country out of this fiscal mess. Mr. President, again, I'm disappointed in the budget we've seen today. I would hope that the Senate will work its will, put together its own budget, taking the President's budget and other ideas, but then coming up with something that actually does address the very real fiscal problems that we face. Bring such a budget to the floor of the Senate, have it debated by both sides, work out what we haven't done in the Senate for over 1,000 days, which is prepare a blueprint for the fiscal and economic future of our country. Until we get such a budget, I fear we'll continue to see this lack of economic growth and job loss that all of us would like to see addressed. Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.